All right, so you know how much we love diving into the latest machine learning papers here, right?
Absolutely. Always looking for those breakthroughs.
Well, this one caught my eye because it's tackling a problem that I think a lot of developers can relate to, how to make sure their code actually, works. And it ties in with this whole wave of using LLMs for, well, pretty much everything these days.
Yeah, code generation, testing, it's all getting a serious AI boost.
Right, but it's not always as simple as just, throw an LLM at it and everything's magically fixed. There are nuances, especially when you're dealing with, let's say, a giant complex code base.
Makes sense. It's like if you're trying to find a specific tiny error in this massive system, having the AI look at every single line of code might not be the most efficient approach.
Exactly, and that's where this paper comes in. It's called Static Program Analysis Guided LLM-Based Unit Test Generation. Quite a mouthful, but don't worry, we'll break it down. The authors are from Ericsson, and there's also an independent researcher involved.
Okay, so right off the bat, it sounds like they're trying to use LLMs to automate unit testing, which is a pretty big deal for software development.
Huge. Unit tests are those little pieces of code that basically check if individual parts of your software are working as expected. They're super important for catching bugs early on.
For sure. And if you can automate that process, especially for complicated code, that could save developers a ton of time and headaches.
Absolutely. So the main challenge they were addressing here is how to get LLMs to generate good unit tests, especially for, like we said, large and complex Java code bases. And the key is to do it without just overwhelming the LLM with tons of irrelevant information. It's about being smart with the context we provide, not just giving it more and more data.
Right, because LLMs have limits too. You can't just feed them an entire encyclopedia and expect them to instantly understand a specific concept. You need to give them the relevant pages, so to speak.
Perfect analogy. So let's dig into their approach. They use something called static program analysis, which is basically a way to examine code without actually running it.
Oh yeah, I've used static analysis tools before. They can help catch potential issues early on, like those dreaded null pointer exceptions.
Exactly. It's like analyzing the blueprint of a building to spot structural weaknesses before you even start construction. And in this case, they're using static analysis to pull out the essential bits of information about the specific piece of Java code they want to test, like what class it belongs to, what other methods it interacts with, the types of data it handles, all that jazz.
So instead of giving the LLM the entire code base, they're giving it this curated, focused set of information that's directly relevant to the method they're trying to test.
Precisely. And their argument is that this targeted approach leads to much more accurate and useful unit tests compared to just throwing the whole kitchen sink at the LLM.
That's a bold claim. Did they actually test it out on some real code?
Oh, absolutely. They ran their experiments on two main data sets. One was a big commercial Java project, the kind of complex systems that power a lot of the software we use every day. And the other was Google's Guava library, which is a pretty well-known open source project that's known for its high quality.
Oh, wow. So they really put it to the test on some serious code bases.
They did. And they even used a few different LLMs, Llama, Llama, even GPT-4, to see if their approach was consistent across different models.
Interesting. So before we get to those results, I'm curious about how they actually set up the experiments. Like, how did they actually use static analysis to extract the information and feed it to the LLMs?
Yeah, good question. So let's step back a bit and get a better sense of how the paper is structured. They start with a solid introduction where they lay out the importance of unit tests and then introduce LLMs as a potentially game-changing tool for automating this task.
Which makes sense. I mean, that's the whole premise of the paper, right?
Yeah. But they don't just jump in and say, LLMs are amazing, problem solved. They're pretty clear about pointing out the limitations of existing LLM-based approaches.
So they acknowledge that there are, some challenges to overcome.
Definitely. Like, for example, some current methods rely on having lots of examples of how the code being tested is used.
Which might not be very helpful if you're dealing with new code or code that's not used very often.
Exactly. Or if you have a code base that's just so massive that it becomes a huge computational burden to analyze all of it.
Right, because LLMs have their limits.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that sets the stage for their contribution. They introduce this idea of using static analysis to selectively pull out the most relevant bits of information and feed that to the LLM.
Kind of like giving it a cheat sheet for the code it's trying to test.
Yeah, exactly. So they're very upfront about their contributions. One, this novel approach using static program analysis to essentially guide the LLM. And two, they actually evaluate this approach against a more standard method on real complex Java projects.
Okay, so clear goals and a solid plan. I like it.
Right. And they even give you a little roadmap of the paper, mentioning things like the related work section, background on static analysis, their methodology, how they evaluated the results, and so on.
Oh, yeah. The related work section is always a good place to see how a paper fits into the broader research landscape. Did they mention any other interesting approaches?
Definitely. They talk about things like RLPG, which stands for Repo Level Prompt Generator, which is more focused on code completion, not unit test generation. They also discuss monitor-guided decoding, which is another technique that kind of tries to steer the LLM in the right direction.
So clearly positioning their work within the existing research.
Yeah, and it's important to note that they also acknowledge traditional non-AI approaches to unit testing, like tools called EvoSuite and Randup, which have been around for a while.
Right, so they're not pretending LLMs are the only game in town.
Not at all. They also touch on some research that uses machine learning and deep learning for unit test generation, but approaches it as a kind of translation problem.
Interesting.
Yeah, and even work on automatically generating test oracles, basically the expected output of a test, and generating those assert statements that actually check if the code is behaving correctly.
So a pretty comprehensive overview of the field.
Exactly. And it helps us understand how their work is, well, novel.
Makes sense. Now let's talk about the static program analysis part. You mentioned it briefly, but can you give us a bit more detail on what that actually involves?
Sure thing. So, as we said, static analysis is basically examining the code without actually running it. And it's super useful for finding potential problems early on, like things that could cause the program to crash or behave unexpectedly. It can even help with, those code completion features in your IDE that suggest what you might want to type next.
Oh, yeah, I love those features. They can be real time savers.
Totally. So in terms of the actual process, there are a few key steps. First, they need to parse the Java code, which means breaking it down into its grammatical components, kind of like a linguist analyzing a sentence to understand its structure.
So taking apart the code to see how it all fits together.
Exactly. And from that, they create something called an abstract syntax tree, or AST. It's basically a tree-like representation of the code's structure.
Okay, so kind of like a visual map of the code.
Exactly. And then they use these things called symbolic solvers to analyze these trees. These solvers can figure out, for instance, the data types of different variables and what kinds of inputs and outputs a method is expecting.
So that's where they get that detailed information about the method's signature, like you mentioned earlier.
Exactly. And that's really important for the next part, which is actually generating the unit tests using the LLM.
Okay, so this is where the rubber meets the road. How does their methodology actually work?
Right. So they use this really helpful motivating example in the paper to illustrate their approach. They show a simple Java method and then demonstrate two different ways an LLM could be prompted to generate a test for it.
Okay, so two different prompting strategies. What's the difference?
Well, the first one, which they kind of present as the more naive approach, is just giving the LLM the raw code of the method and saying, hey, write a unit test for this.
So just kind of throwing the code at it and seeing what happens.
Yeah, and often this leads to the LLM making some incorrect assumptions. Like maybe it doesn't quite understand how the method is supposed to be used, or it guesses the wrong data types for the inputs. And the result is that it might generate test code that doesn't even compile properly.
Right, because Java is very strict about those things.
Exactly. So that's where the second prompting strategy comes in, and this is the core of their innovation. They take the raw code of the method, but they also add in all this extra information that they extracted using static program analysis. Things like what class the method belongs to, the exact definitions of any other methods it calls, and crucially, the data types of the parameters for those methods.
So they're giving the LLM all those crucial contextual details that it might have missed otherwise.
Yeah, and they show that this leads to the LLM generating much more accurate and, most importantly, functional unit test code that actually compiles and runs and does what it's supposed to do.
Okay, that's a really clear demonstration of their point. But for those of us who are maybe a bit more technically minded, can you walk us through the nitty-gritty details of their static analysis process?
Of course. They spell out the steps really well. So they use this library called the Java Parser library to actually analyze the code, and they specifically extract three main things. First, the declaring class of the method they're trying to test. Basically, what larger chunk of code does this method belong to? Then they get the complete signatures of all the methods that the focal method calls. These signatures are super important because they specify exactly how each method should be used, what kind of input it expects, what kind of output it produces, and finally they get the data types of any fields that the focal method uses. Fields are like variables that store data within a class.
Okay, so they're really gathering a pretty detailed understanding of how the method interacts with its surroundings.
Yeah. And then they incorporate all this information into their prompting strategy. They specifically tell the LLM to generate unit tests using JUnit, which is the most common testing framework in the Java world. And they also tell it to use Mockito, which is a popular library for isolating dependencies.
Oh, Mockito, yeah, I've used that. It's really helpful for making sure you're only testing one specific piece of code at a time and not getting bogged down by all the other stuff it might interact with.
Exactly. And they make a really good point about how important those exact method signatures are for this whole mocking process. Because in a strongly typed language like Java, if you get those signatures even slightly wrong, your tests are going to fail.
Right. It's like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. The types have to match up perfectly.
Totally. So that's the gist of their methodology. Now let's talk about the actual evaluation. They really wanted to make sure their approach was robust and would work in real-world scenarios. So they chose two data sets, as we mentioned. One was a large commercial Java project, which I can't name specifically, but it represents the kind of complex real-world code that a lot of developers work with.
So they weren't just testing this on, toy examples or simple code snippets.
Nope. They wanted to see if it could handle the big stuff. And the other data set was Google's Guava library. It's open source, so it's publicly available, and it's known for its high quality and well-tested code.
Right, so a good benchmark to compare against. And in terms of LLMs, you said they use Llama, CodeLlama, and even GPT-4.
Yeah, they wanted to see if their approach was generally applicable across different models. Now, they couldn't use GPT-4 on the commercial code base because obviously that's proprietary data. But for the open source Guava library, they were able to include it in their tests.
That makes sense. So how did they actually measure success?
Well, their main metric was pretty straightforward. They looked at how many methods, out of all the ones they tested, they were able to generate at least one unit test for.
Okay, so a basic but crucial first step. If the LLM can't even generate a test, then it doesn't really matter how good that test is.
Exactly. And their main research question was, does adding this precise program structure information to the prompt actually increase the number of methods for which we can generate at least one unit test?
So a clear hypothesis to test.
Yep. Now, to get into the specifics of the experiments, they randomly selected a subset of the methods from the commercial project. I think it was around 103 methods. And then from the Guava library, they picked two Java classes at random, which had about 34 public methods.
Okay, so a decent sample size.
Yeah, enough to get some statistically significant results. And they ran two sets of tests for each of these sets of methods. The first was what they call the baseline approach. This was based on some previous research, where you basically give the LLM the entire source code file and some initial comments that suggest where the unit test should go.
So kind of the more traditional LLM approach without their static analysis guidance.
Right. And then the second set of tests was their own approach, where they provided only the specific method being tested, along with that carefully extracted structural information.
Okay, so a head-to-head comparison. I'm eager to hear how it turned out.
Well, hold on. Before we get to the results, let's just quickly touch on the implementation details. They're pretty transparent about all the technical stuff. They specify the exact parameters they use for the LLMs, things like the maximum number of input tokens, the temperature setting, top case sampling, all that.
Oh yeah, all the fun stuff.
Right. They also mention the hardware they use, a single A100 80 GB GPU, which is pretty beefy.
Yeah, you need some serious compute power to run these big LLMs.
Totally. And they describe the whole process of using the Java parser library to extract the method signatures, the field types, all that, and then how they formatted the prompts for the LLMs and collected the output. They're really thorough about it. And that's good because it allows other researchers to reproduce their work and build upon it.
Okay, so full transparency on the experimental setup. Now let's get to the juicy part, the results.
Okay, drum roll, please. So across all the LLMs, they tested Llama 7B, Llama 70B, CodeLlama 34B, and GPT-4. Their program analysis guided prompting consistently led to more unit tests being generated compared to the baseline approach.
Wow, so their hypothesis was supported.
Yeah. And it was a pretty significant difference, too. For example, on the commercial project, their approach led to unit tests being generated for, I think it's something like 30, 40% more of the methods compared to the baseline.
Impressive. And what about the Guava library?
Similar story there. Their approach generally outperformed the baseline across all the LLMs, including GPT-4.
Okay, so pretty solid evidence that their technique is effective.
Right. And they delve into some possible reasons for this in the discussion section. They argued that the baseline approach, where you're giving the LLM the entire source file, likely overwhelms it with too much information. A lot of that code is probably irrelevant to the specific method being tested.
So it's kind of like trying to find a needle in a haystack.
Yeah, exactly. Whereas with their approach, the LLM is only getting the absolutely essential information, so it can focus more effectively on the task at hand. And they actually have some data to support this. They measured the average and median length of the prompts in terms of tokens.
Oh, interesting. So were the prompts significantly shorter?
Yep, much shorter. Which also suggests some potential cost benefits in real-world scenarios because a lot of these LLM APIs are priced based on token usage.
Right, so not only more effective, but potentially more cost-efficient too.
Exactly. And they also talk about how their approach could potentially be applied to other programming languages, since most languages have similar tools for parsing and analyzing code. And the fact that they tested it on both commercial and open source code, chosen somewhat randomly, suggests that it's not limited to just specific types of methods or coding styles.
So pretty versatile and generalizable technique.
It seems so.
Yeah.
And they wrap it all up in the conclusion section, where they summarize their innovation, their main findings, and some potential avenues for future work.
What kind of future work did they suggest?
Well, one obvious next step is to actually deploy this in real-world development environments and see how it performs in practice. They also mentioned the need to evaluate the quality of the generated tests more deeply, like, are these tests actually good at catching bugs? Are they comprehensive?
Right, because just generating a test isn't enough. It has to be a good test.
Totally. And they also talk about extending their approach to other programming languages, which makes sense. They also acknowledge some limitations of their current study. For example, they focused mainly on whether a test was generated at all, not necessarily how good that test was.
Which is fair enough for a first step.
Yeah. And they hint at some potentially interesting research directions, like combining their method with techniques like in-context learning or fine-tuning the LLMs themselves.
Oh, that's interesting. So potentially using the results of the tests to actually improve the LLM over time.
Exactly. So really, this paper fits into this broader history of trying to automate software testing. We've gone from, early kind of brute force methods like randomly generating inputs to more sophisticated search-based techniques that try to systematically explore different execution paths. And now LLMs are entering the picture, offering this potential for even more intelligent and context-aware test generation.
And what this paper shows is that it's not just about blindly applying LLMs to the problem. It's about understanding how to use them effectively. And sometimes that means combining them with other techniques, like static program analysis, to get the best results.
Absolutely. The key takeaway here is that the quality of the information you feed to the LLM matters just as much as the quantity. And this has some really interesting real-world implications for developers. I mean, imagine being able to automatically generate a decent set of unit tests for even legacy code that's been around for years and might not be well documented.
Yeah, that could be a huge time saver and potentially help uncover hidden bugs in old code.
Right. And it could free up developers to focus on more creative and strategic tasks, leading to better software overall. Whether it's, critical infrastructure for things like telecom networks or just the everyday apps we all use, improving the quality of software has a ripple effect across so many aspects of our lives.
Definitely. And the potential for cost savings in the development process is also huge.
All right, so for a novel notions segment where we like to, brainstorm some potential research directions based on what we've learned, I've got a couple of ideas that kind of build on this whole idea of static program analysis and LLMs for unit test generation.
I'm all ears. Let's hear them.
Okay, so research idea 1, dynamic program analysis, guided LLM fine-tuning for enhanced test quality. So this paper used static analysis to essentially guide the LLM's prompting, right? But what if we use dynamic analysis to actually improve the LLM itself over time?
I'm intrigued. Explain more.
So imagine this. We take those initial unit tests that the LLM generated using the static analysis guidance, and then we run them. But we don't just check if they pass or fail. We also analyze things like code coverage, like how much of the actual code did those tests actually exercise. And we also look for any unexpected behaviors or errors that pop up during runtime.
Okay, so gathering data on how those initial tests perform in practice.
Exactly. And we use that information to fine-tune the LLM. Like, if we see that certain parts of the code are never tested, or if we notice patterns in the types of failures that occur, we can use that feedback to train the LLM to generate better, more targeted tests in the future.
So it's like continuous improvement loop where the LLM learns from the results of the tests it generates.
Yeah. And there's already a lot of research out there on test coverage analysis and fault localization that we could build on.
I love it. It's like taking their approach and adding this whole other layer of intelligence.
Right. So research idea 2, a hybrid LLM architecture with a dedicated static analysis module. Now, in this paper, they basically fed the output of the static analysis into the LLM as part of the text prompt.
Right.
But what if we designed an LLM that actually had a specific component that was trained to understand and process those structured outputs from static analysis tools, like those abstract syntax trees and control flow graphs we talked about?
So like giving the LLM a built-in expert on code structure.
Yeah. And this static analysis module could then feed its knowledge into the main code generation part of the LLM in a much more sophisticated way than just, sticking it into the text prompt.
Makes sense. It's like giving the LLM a deeper, more intuitive understanding of the code it's working with.
Exactly. And there's a lot of interesting work being done on modular neural networks that could potentially be relevant here.
Yeah, I see the potential there. And if it works, it could lead to a whole new generation of much more powerful code generation and analysis tools.
Absolutely. All right, so those are just a couple of novel notions to get you thinking. Remember, this is all speculative, but it's fun to explore the possibilities, right?
For sure. And who knows, maybe one of our listeners will take one of these ideas and run with it.
That'd be awesome. And if you want to dig into the details of the paper we discussed today, you can find a link down below.
Always good to go straight to the source.
Absolutely. Until next time, keep exploring the fascinating world of machine learning.